Hello and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Director and Business Line Leader here at Intertek for our Medical and Laboratory Division. And today I am joined by one of my colleagues from our Boxborough, Massachusetts office, Bill Stearns. Bill, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So really excited to chat with you today. So Bill is one of our leading experts in everything robotics and implantables. So maybe, Bill, you can give a little bit of an introduction to yourself and how you got into the business and interested in the robotics space.
Okay, well, I was started out many years ago as a technician and then worked my way up as a design engineer for many years, designing network equipment for companies like Lucent Technologies and some startup companies as well. But then I got into compliance, roughly, I don't know, about 15, 16 years ago. So I've been doing medical compliance for that long, and have been involved with medical robots on many of them, and also I'm kind of focusing on implantables as well, as you said. But today, I guess we're going to talk about robots, and so
very excited. Yeah, very excited to talk about that.
Yeah. And honestly, robots are very similar to many other types of equipment, but they do have some unique things about them that we can talk about.
Absolutely. And I think, you have a very interesting purview. Obviously, you sit in one of our largest medical centers, but you've also, been in the industry quite a long time. You've had a lot of experience. So you've seen kind of the changes in technology that we've seen and this move towards, a space where we're having more devices that have some level of autonomy or semi-autonomous or with the robotics. So just in general, what have you seen, in your 10, 15 plus years working at Intertek with this shift to these robotic type devices?
Well, so, there's all kinds of levels of autonomy, and they go up from, it starts at full manual, which is really not a robot, all the way up to full autonomy. And there's 10 levels in between. For the most part, we focused on level 2, which is really just a teleoperated type of robot, where most of the decision-making processes are done by the operator, by the surgeon. So in other words, he's in full control, but the robot is monitoring force, and it's also teleoperated. So that's mostly what we see. But we do have we have seen some other robots with a little bit more autonomy, where they can make some movements themselves and make some more decision making themselves. But right now, a lot of the robots that we've been focused on are pretty much teleoperated. So that means full control of the surgeon. But they're increasing. They're going to be more and more autonomy in the future, I think.
Yeah. And I think, we've talked a lot about it on this podcast with some of our different guests, looking at, all of the impacts that the pandemic have had on not only our lives, but also on the medical industry, right? And so a lot of this move away from, being so, person to person focused and having additional levels of autonomy or incorporating that into the devices themselves, right? And I think you're so right that we'll probably just see more of these as time goes on and technology advances, right? Where there'll be more autonomous or semi-autonomous, right, operation within these types of medical devices. So really interesting to see kind of how far we've come and likely where we'll continue to go.
Yeah, what we've also seen is there are manufacturers that are recording the movements of these teleoperated robots. So they're recording the movements, recording the procedures, so that they can add autonomy later into their product. So wow. First you have to learn the motions, and then some of the robots, especially if you think about sewing tissue inside the abdomen, they're tiny little grabbers, and the surgeons are holding these big handles, and they're just moving just like they were their real hands. It's really incredible to watch the skill that they have, and so to be able to duplicate that is going to take some effort, I think.
Yeah, amazing to think of what, technology is moving towards and that potential, right? But of course, coming back to, as you say, right, it all starts with a human, right, doing it and then figuring out how to replicate that. So for our manufacturers, right, when we're looking into this, this space of robotics, what are things that they should be considering? Obviously, there's standard requirements. What are some of those? I mean, with a medical robot, do we think about things like functional safety? Like what should we be considering from an actual standards requirement standpoint?
Well, so I guess it depends on where they are in their process. Obviously, when it comes to regulatory, what we do, we always promote design review as soon as possible, because one day looking at a design early on can really solve some, or at least spot some issues early on, and many times we see products that are almost completely done get in here and they have a major flaw, and then that's a bad time to find it. So we like to promote early design reviews, and that involves looking at their isolation strategies, looking at the components that they're using, things like that. We can look at their risk management files, make sure they're addressing hazards properly. And that they're going to document things. Sometimes they get so complicated that it's very difficult to deal with when we get to our point. So I would just say that would be my number one thing to get started with. Obviously, there's a lot of standards involved, different standards that they need to consider as well.
Yeah. So if you're thinking about, from an early onset, right? So having a level of design review, design guidance, either if you're incorporating an autonomous function or developing a robot in some space for medical, that obviously would help to set someone up for success to then identify, as we get into standards and what the requirements are. So, we see things like the 277, 278. Maybe you can touch on just a couple of the common robotic standards we see. And then, I think, questions come up often about functional safety and if that applies to medical devices and medical robots.
Right. So, just like all medical equipment, just to start, robots will require the general standard for starters, 601. Then they also will they'll need to be doing a usability study for, it's just 60601-1-6 and 62366. And then they have to, their software needs to be developed under the 62304, which is a software process standard. Everything is rolled around 14971, which is a risk management standard. And then there are, those are all collaterals. And then there are a couple of particular standards, one for surgical robots, which is, like you said, 80601-2-77. And then there's another robotic standard for essentially rehabilitation style robots, which is 278. But also the thing that, what a lot of people might miss is that 277 and specifically requires, interoperability with, if you're using other equipment such as surgical generators or, endoscopic equipment, you need to apply all those standards as well. And sometimes that gets missed.
Yeah, so you could have a lot of standards applying to your single system that may have a robotic element, but of course you also then have to consider all of the other particular standards that would apply to the other functionality of the system.
Alarms too.
Yeah, right? Of course. Yeah.
A lot of robots have alarms.
Definitely.
And if alarm, we look at the alarms. A lot of times an alarm will go off and it'll stop, right? And so the 277, which is for surgical robots, has all these different levels of protective stops. So, for instance, a normal stop would be, during a procedure, you might just stop, or maybe the surgeon looks away from the console. He's wearing glasses. And if he looks away from the console, the robot will stop. And that's called a normal stop. So that's just normal. If he's going to look over at the robot, working on the patient, he's over on the other side of the room in front of a console, let's say. And if he wants to go look over and see what's going on, the the robot's going to stop. So that's the normal stop. But then you have protective stops, like something might go wrong, or maybe there's too much force somewhere. Maybe one of the arms picks up too much force, so it'll stop the motion, and an alarm will go off. Things start blinking, and then. But one thing different about robots is, when alarms go off and we have emergency stops, we don't want to shut power off like a lot of.
Yeah.
You never want to shut the power off on a surgical robot because you're in somebody's body at that point.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. And so shutting the power off is the last thing you want to do. So that's why you have all these different levels of protective stop. And so we look at all of that, and it's all identified through risk management.
Yeah. And I like to kind of dig into that a little bit more. So, we talk about you come in, you're deciding either to incorporate a robotic element or you're developing a new robot. You do a preliminary design review. It helps you to kind of identify the standards, identify your pathway and your plan, right? Is 277 right for you? Is 278? What additional particular standards apply? So then let's talk a little bit about, risk management and how a risk assessment looks different with robots. I know we see with a lot of standard medical devices that, the risk management and the risk assessment can impact the way that we do testing. How essential is the risk analysis in that portion when you're looking at something like a robot or something that's robot assisted?
So like anything, it's complexity, right? So some of the robots we've seen are very complex, and they have multiple pieces. So, if all the way from, surgeon consoles to robotic arms to, system consoles to, and then the individual tools. So, and then the arms themselves, the actual robot arms themselves. So, it's a big system, and it's so big that most companies aren't developing one piece themselves, so it's getting developed across multiple manufacturers or or multiple teams within the same company, and that's where a lot of the complexity is, because if you have a large system with multiple components, each team is focused on their own system, and then all those requirements and hazards all need to bubble to the top top system, and so it sometimes gets very complicated because there's so many levels to the risk management file. So we've seen it all different ways. We've seen it very complicated, and we've seen it not as complicated. So it really one thing we always hope is that everybody's using the same quality system, because if you're using different quality systems, and that now you're not only having to review all the different levels of this risk management file for the different sub-assemblies, you're having to look at different quality systems. So hopefully we have the same quality system between all these different sub-assemblies, but not always.
Yeah, and I think that is such an interesting point, because now we're seeing, as you mentioned, right, with some of these really complex systems that involve so many pieces and so many sub-assemblies, that you do have multiple divisions or multiple locations of a similar company all working on the same product system, right? So you have different people who are touching it, and maybe different areas of the risk assessment. So that does put a lot of, coordination and collaboration that's required in order to get these types of products through the process, right? To get all of the information that's needed from each kind of person and piece along the way.
Right. And so we would always say, give us one point of contact and let him disseminate all that information to all the different groups, because it's so hard to sometimes communicate with everybody. And even the communication within their own companies can be difficult. And that's where a lot of the challenges can be we're talking about a very complex product.
Of course, in those systems. Yeah. So, we look at risk assessment, and then I think there's another portion within that sometimes causes some headaches or pain points. And that relates back to like essential performance, right? And essential performance with a robot. So you talk about, okay, we're not just going to stop a robot and have it shut off when it's operating or inside someone's body. We talked about the standards. Are there essential performance requirements that exist within the particular standards? Are we identifying our own essential performance dependent upon our robot and robot risk? How are we viewing that?
Yeah. So the particular standards do call out specific essential performances, but unintended movement's the big one, right?
Okay.
So if you're in a body with a robotic arm under teleoperation, that hole that you're penetrating in the body, that that's a pivot point, right? That you rotate around that one spot. If you move, you're going to rip someone open. So obviously unintended movement is like the most important one. Okay. So everything flows around that. And then just the information, making sure that what you're seeing is what you're doing. What I'm looking at is what, is what's happening, so obviously if I'm, you want to make sure that you have your perspectives right when you're, mostly for surgical robot or robotics, right is right and left is left. And
Yeah.
So, and that the screen doesn't stop, all of a sudden stop working, say when you use a surgical generator, all of a sudden the screen starts flickering on you. I mean, things like that, being able to see what you're doing is also defined as essential performance. So the two for 277 is movement, unintended movement, and information to perform surgery, which would be, just being able to make sure that you're aware of what's going on. And then of course, the risk management file may determine many other essential performance requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you go through the process, you identify the path via, some sort of preliminary compliance, you identify the standards that are required, you get into the risk management portion, you identify the essential performance, then we get into the testing portion itself. So when we're seeing these systems come in and we're doing testing, are we seeing one system coming in and we're replicating, how this testing might be done? How do we actually test these devices when they get to the lab?
Yeah. So, when a lot of times these are very complex systems. So I'm kind of talking about the complex ones. We may only see one sample of a complex system. And so we have to be very careful with it. But we'll run through all the basic safety tests, which, I think we're pretty familiar with, as inputs and temps and whatnot. When we're doing, we also have to apply single fault testing. And that's when we're going to monitor essential performance. In other words, so while the system's up and running and live, we're going to apply some faults, and we're looking to see that the arm doesn't relax and just fall, right, or move, even worse, right. In other words, so when it fails, obviously it needs to fail in a position where it doesn't move. So we're looking for things like that. At the end of the day, though, we can't test everything. I mean, if you have a very complex system, it's really up to the manufacturer to make sure that they've gone through all of their requirements, and they may have hundreds of people to do that. We are looking at their FMEAs, and looking at their documentation to make sure that they've addressed these things, but by no means can we do every single fault that the manufacturer hopefully is doing, that we're checking to see that they're doing. We're going to do a spot check at best, because we just, some of the complexity of some of these systems requires the manufacturer to do their due diligence to make sure that they've thought of all of the hazards and done a proper FMEA, which is a failure mode analysis. In other words, injected failures into their system. Make sure they understand what will happen. So, we do what we can do, but at the end of the day, it's really all about the testing and their process to make sure that they've looked at all of the hazards that can occur. So we're checking that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we've talked about that before on this podcast as well, right? Looking at, this whole risk-based approach, right? So as you say, right, the manufacturer really does have to go through and identify all of their risks and how they're mitigating them. But also I think too, even when you're just describing this process, in general, we see with medical devices and medical device testing, it really is such a collaborative approach between the manufacturer and all the people involved on their side, as well as on the test house side, working with people like ourselves, right, to really make sure that everyone is working in alignment, working together, collaborating and sharing that information. Because when you're dealing with, such complex systems that have a lot of not only paperwork requirements, documentation requirements, testing requirements, there's a lot of back and forth and working together that's obviously required.
Exactly. I think the days of dropping the sample off at a test house and saying, okay, test it, and then we test it, we say, yep, it's good, no hazards here.
Yeah.
Those days are over.
Take it back.
Those days are over. The systems are too complex, and the manufacturers really do need to make sure that they do their due diligence to make sure that all the faults that could occur are covered. So I like to look at their FMEAs really close, and make sure that they've considered all of the things that can happen. So.
Yeah. So in this documentation review phase, as well as in the testing phase, are there common pitfalls that we see, common mistakes or suggestions that we could say as best practices, things that manufacturers should be aware of, or things that we oftentimes see as causing issues or challenges?
Well, I think in general for medical devices, not just robotic devices, the isolation strategy is usually where a lot of mistakes get made right up front. So that needs to be looked at right away. For robots, you have a lot of times you have a metal robot arm that comes all the way down to the patient, and then you have all kinds of instruments that connect to the end effectors. And it's usually those end effectors is where the isolation occurs. But we've seen some robots where that wasn't really thought out well. But after some design reviews, they beefed up their end effectors. Usually they, a lot of times will be made out of plastic. So it's very simple. You make these things out of plastic, and now you have the isolation that you need. And a lot of times what's not thought about is that, you require a little more isolation when you're holding a RF surgical instrument. So, so a lot of times they didn't think about, hey, we're going to hold RF surgical instruments here. We didn't really think about, compatibility with RF surgical. So, so I would say isolation is probably the first thing we look at in almost any medical product, really, is the key thing to start with, because that usually affects hardware. Yeah. Risk management, those kinds of things can be kind of solved along the way or after the fact. But if you screw up on your isolation strategy, that involves hardware, and that's painful sometimes.
Yeah, especially when you think of the long design cycles, and now of course we're dealing with everything with redesigns and components and suppliers, right? It can cause issues. So you want to make sure that you're having that all figured out up on the front end, as you mentioned. Anything hardware changes related. Yeah. Well, wonderful. I mean, Bill, this has been such a good conversation. I've loved chatting about robots. Is there anything else that you think people should know? Anything else that we want to share in terms of, where we anticipate this market going, what we think we'll continue to see, or anything as it relates to the compliance with these medical robotics and devices?
Well, I think, more autonomy is on its way. And I think I'm sure there's some highly autonomous robots out there that I just haven't been involved in. But I know that more autonomy is on its way. I know that the instruments are getting smaller. Right now, some of the stuff I've seen is, you have one instrument per opening, body opening or trocar. Now maybe there'll be some more instruments coming down through, so less openings in the body, smaller instruments and less openings, less invasive. So that might be on its way. That's pretty much my purview. I think is just more autonomy and smaller.
Yeah, and I think it's exciting, right? It's exciting to be part of the medical industry at this time as someone who works in the industry, but also thinking about patient and patient futures and the outcomes for patients by having these types of devices and these devices more readily available and more, available across the market. I think it's just incredible to see the advancements that have been made over the past few years. And I'm sure, we'll continue to see, thanks to all of these incredible manufacturers who are developing these amazing medical products. So really great to chat with you today. So happy to have you here with us. I'm sure we'll get lots of questions as they relate to robotics. So if anyone has those, they can reach out to me directly, email me, and I will get those questions passed along to Bill. Appreciate everyone joining us today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and do your design review.
Yes, exactly. Key takeaway, do your design review. Absolutely.
Do your design review and solve problems before they occur. So.
Prepare early, prepare often, right? Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I would say, yes.
Yes, great final note. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.